The villa still stands on its hillside above the Hudson River, cream stucco walls, a red tile roof, 34 rooms looking out over the water as they have for more than a century. From a boat, it reads like old money. The kind of estate that suggests generations, a family name in the county records going back to before the Civil War. The truth is more extraordinary than that. In 1918, Madam C.J. Walker moved into Villa Lewaro at the age of 50. The mansion had cost her $250,000, the most expensive home ever purchased by a black American. She employed a full household staff. She kept a custom electric car in the garage, mahogany trimmed, silent as ambition. She had built her fortune from $1.50 a day as a washerwoman, and she had built it into an empire. 40,000 agents, factories, a hair care company that reached from Harlem to Havana. She had done everything that wealth was supposed to require. And within 6 months of moving in, the local country club rejected her membership application without explanation. The yacht club turned her family away. White neighbors circulated petitions. Children on the block were told not to look. This is where simpler stories would center the wound. But Villa Lewaro is not a monument to rejection. It never was. Walker made a different calculation, the kind that separates builders from victims. If the clubs would not have her, she would create something the clubs could never match. She opened her doors to W.E.B. Du Bois, to James Weldon Johnson, to Mary McLeod Bethune. The music room hosted performances. The library held strategy sessions. The dining room, which seated 24, fed a movement. In a neighborhood that refused to acknowledge her, she built a headquarters. Villa Lewaro still stands. The restoration is ongoing. And what the house has always been, a declaration made in stone and marble by a woman who refused the terms the world offered her, remains, after all this time, entirely legible. The year was 1867. 2 years after Appomattox. 2 years after the country had finished tearing itself apart over the question of whether one human being could own another. The answer finally was no. But answers on paper and answers on the ground are different things entirely. In the Delta parishes of Louisiana, freedom had arrived without land, without wages, without the infrastructure of an ordinary life. The Breedlove family, Owen, Minerva, and their children, worked the same plantation they had always worked, the same soil, the same rows, the same harvest. The difference was accounting. They were sharecroppers now. They owed the landowner a portion of everything they grew. They no longer belonged to him. They were simply indebted to him, which in practice looked very much the same. On December 23rd of that year, Minerva Breedlove gave birth to a daughter. They named her Sarah. She was the first child in the family born free, the first who would not, under the law of the United States, belong to another human being. It was a distinction that meant everything in principle, and almost nothing yet in daily life. The cabin had one room. The floor was dirt. Sarah could walk the length of her entire world in 30 steps. She was in the cotton fields as soon as she was old enough to be useful. Her mother died in 1874, yellow fever. Sarah was 7 years old. Her father followed within the year. The exact cause unclear, the effect absolute. 2 orphan children, Sarah and her older sister Lavinia, with nowhere to go except north to Vicksburg, Mississippi, where Lavinia's husband had a room and, as it turned out, a disposition that Sarah would later describe, in the careful language of a woman who had learned to choose her words, as cruel. She married at 14. His name was Moses McWilliams. He was 19. Sarah said openly, without apparent shame or self-pity, that she had married him to get out of the house. The marriage produced one child, a daughter, Lelia, born in 1885. 2 years later, Moses was dead. The circumstances were never clarified publicly. Some accounts suggest he was lynched, others say accident. Sarah never discussed it. She was 20 years old, widowed, with a 2-year-old, and no particular reason to expect that things would improve. She moved to St. Louis in 1889. Her brothers were there, working as barbers, a trade that offered black men in that era a measure of economic stability and social standing. They earned enough to keep rooms, feed families, maintain the minimum conditions of a dignified life. Sarah arrived in their orbit and found work as a washerwoman. She scrubbed clothes for white families 6 days a week. The lye soap burned her hands. The work was physical and relentless and paid roughly $1.50 a day when the work was steady, which it wasn't always. From that $1.50, she paid rent. She bought food. She kept Lelia in school, a decision she held to even when it meant Sarah herself went without eating. Education was the thing she had never had and intended to give her daughter regardless of what it cost. It cost quite a lot. And it was not the worst of what she was carrying. Her hair was falling out. The stress of widowhood and poverty, the poor nutrition, the scalp disease that came from the practical impossibility of washing your hair with any regularity when hot water was a luxury and your day was consumed by other people's laundry. All of it had damaged her hairline in ways she could see every morning. In the 1890s, black women had almost no remedies available to them. The commercial hair care industry did not consider them customers worth addressing. The products that existed were harsh, often caustic, formulated for different hair textures and different scalps. The alternatives were braiding, wrapping, covering, managing visibility rather than solving the problem. Going bald, in a society that already worked to deny black women every available form of dignity, was its own particular cruelty. Sarah tried everything she could find. Nothing worked. Then, in 1904, she had a dream. She described it this way publicly in the language of revelation. A large man appeared and gave her a formula. She wrote down the ingredients. She mixed them. She applied the mixture to her scalp. Her hair grew back. Whether the dream was literal or a story she told because the truth, years of quiet experimentation, of watching what worked and what didn't, of the kind of hard empirical attention that poverty teaches, was less compelling for a sales pitch than divine inspiration. No one can say with certainty. What is certain is that the formula worked. It contained sulfur, which addressed the scalp conditions that caused her hair loss. It contained conditioning oils that treated the hair itself. It was not chemically revolutionary, but it was effective, and it was specifically designed for black women, which made it, in the marketplace of 1904, essentially without competition. She began selling it door to door in the neighborhood she knew. The results traveled faster than she did. Word moved through black churches and social clubs and beauty parlors, the informal infrastructure of community that has always carried more information than any newspaper. Women who had watched their hairlines recede began to see them return. They told their sisters and their neighbors, and the women they prayed beside on Sunday mornings. In 1905, Sarah packed what she had, $1.50 in savings, her formula, and whatever remained of the certainty that had gotten her this far, and moved to Denver. A brother-in-law had written about opportunities there. She took him at his word. During the day, she cooked. At night, she worked the streets of Black Denver, knocking on doors, carrying her products, delivering a sales pitch that was not really a sales pitch at all. It was a proposition. It was an argument she had been making, quietly, her entire life. Black women deserved to look and feel beautiful. Healthy hair was not vanity. It was self-respect. It was the right to take up space in the world without apology. The message found its audience. It always does, when it's true. Sales grew. Steadily, then quickly, then in ways that required her to stop thinking of herself as a washerwoman who sold a product on the side and start thinking of herself as something the English language in 1905 had almost no template for, a black woman building a business. She was 38 years old. She had buried both parents before her 7th birthday. She had married to escape abuse, been widowed under circumstances she would never speak of, raised a child alone on $1.50 a day, and watched her hair fall out from the accumulated weight of all of it. Now she was beginning. What she would build from here, the factories, the agents, the empire, the mansion on the Hudson River, all of it was still ahead. But the architecture of it was already present in the way she knocked on doors in Denver at the end of a long day's cooking and told black women, with the quiet conviction of someone who had lived the alternative, that they were worth caring for. That was the foundation. Everything else was just construction. In January of 1906, Sarah Breedlove married Charles Joseph Walker. He was a newspaper advertising salesman, a man who understood, professionally, how images and words could be arranged to make people believe in something. She was a woman who had already discovered, through necessity, that the same was true. It was, among other things, a practical alliance. She took his surname. She took something else from it too. Madam C.J. Walker. The title was a deliberate construction. In the early 20th century, Madam carried specific weight. It suggested Paris. It suggested expertise. It suggested a woman who had studied her craft in rooms most people would never enter. It was the language of European couture houses and perfumeries, of establishments that charged more because they understood that price itself communicates authority. Sarah Breedlove, who had scrubbed laundry in St. Louis for $1.50 a day, understood this intuitively. She was not misrepresenting herself. She was reframing herself. There is a difference, and the people who built the great American dynasties, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the men whose names are now carved into university buildings and museum wings, understood it just as well. Every brand is a story someone decided to tell first. Charles designed the early advertisements and helped expand distribution. The marriage lasted 6 years before ending in divorce, cleanly and without apparent sentiment on either side. The business partnership, however, had already done what it needed to do. The name was established. The architecture was in place. What she built inside it was entirely her own. By 1907, the Walker agents were moving through black neighborhoods across the country, knocking on doors, opening cases, demonstrating a system. The Walker method, as it came to be called, was a sequence. Wash with Walker's vegetable shampoo, treat the scalp with wonderful hair grower, style with a heated comb. Each step was precise. Each step was teachable. Walker had not invented the heated comb. That tool had existed for decades. But she had done something more commercially significant than invention. She had organized isolated techniques into a coherent, repeatable system, trained women to execute it professionally, and created the distribution network to deliver it. The agents were the network. In 1908, Walker moved the operation to Pittsburgh and opened Lelia College, a training school for Walker agents named for her daughter. Women paid tuition to learn the method. They received certificates upon completion. They could then purchase Walker products at wholesale and resell them, keeping the margin. It was a franchise before the word existed in its modern sense, a model that replicated itself through other people's labor, while maintaining quality control at the center. The economics were straightforward, and, for the women involved, transformative. A Walker agent earned $5 to $15 a week. Top performers cleared over $1,000 a year. To understand what that meant, domestic service, the primary employment available to black women in that era, the work of cleaning other people's houses and raising other people's children, paid a fraction of that. Walker had created an alternative, not just a product, an alternative economy operating inside the larger one that had decided black women's labor was worth almost nothing. She believed, and said so plainly, that every agent represented something larger than herself every time she knocked on a door. The quality of the work was a form of argument. A well-trained, well-presented Walker agent, conducting herself with professional competence in a stranger's home, was making a case that the broader culture was actively trying to suppress. Walker understood the stakes. She calibrated accordingly. By 1910, Pittsburgh had become too small for what she was running. She chose Indianapolis with the precision of a logistics executive: central location, strong railroad connections, a growing black population, favorable conditions for manufacturing. She purchased a lot on Northwest Street and built a factory. The Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company mixed products, filled jars, and shipped orders outward to a network that now numbered in the thousands. Walker invested in modern equipment. She implemented quality control at a time when most companies in her market had none. And on every label, her photograph. This was not vanity. It was strategy of the highest order. The same strategy that the great commercial dynasties of the era employed when they put a founding family's name on a product to signal continuity, trustworthiness, personal accountability. Walker understood that she was not selling hair care. She was selling the woman who had created it, and what that woman's existence proved was possible. Her image on the label was a promise. It was also an argument. By 1911, she had over 1,000 agents operating across the United States and the Caribbean. The expansion into Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, and Central America was not accidental. It was the recognition that the market the major commercial houses had collectively ignored extended across an entire hemisphere. Wherever black women lived, Walker saw customers whose dignity was worth addressing. The agents followed the logic. Sales exceeded $1,000 a day. Critics followed too. Certain black intellectuals and journalists raised the question that would trail Walker for the rest of her life and shadow the company long after her death. Was straightening hair an act of self-erasure? Was the Walker system, whatever its health benefits, ultimately an accommodation to a white standard of appearance, a commercial enterprise built on the premise that black women's natural hair required correction? Walker answered directly and without apology. Her products treated scalp disease. They gave women whose hairlines had been damaged by stress and poor nutrition, and the absence of any adequate commercial option, a means of recovery. They allowed black women to present themselves in professional settings on their own terms. The choice of what to do with one's hair, she argued, belonged to the woman whose hair it was, and the absence of choice, which had been the condition before, was not dignity. It was deprivation dressed up as authenticity. Her customers settled the debate with their purchasing decisions. The argument itself, however, did not end. It has not ended. The same questions about presentation, assimilation, and the politics of black appearance that Walker fielded in 1911 are still being asked today in different registers in different rooms. What Walker left behind was not a resolution, but a precedent. The idea that black women were entitled to make their own decisions about their own bodies, and that a business built on that premise was worth building. In 1912, she sailed. Few black American women of that era had the resources to travel internationally, and fewer still moved through foreign countries in the manner Walker chose. Not as tourists, not as curiosities, but as a businesswoman conducting a business. She visited Panama, Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, Costa Rica. In each country, she met with local women, established distribution relationships, studied the specific conditions, different climates, different hair textures, different needs, and adapted her product line in response. She also photographed herself. The images appeared in black newspapers across the United States. Walker in elegant clothing, standing before tropical landscapes. Walker in conversation with local dignitaries. Walker at landmarks that wealthy white Americans visited on leisure trips, while black Americans built their railroads and cleaned their hotel rooms. The photographs were dispatched with the precision of a public relations campaign because that is what they were. They communicated, in the visual language that newspapers across the country would reproduce and distribute, a single, unambiguous fact. A black woman born on a Louisiana cotton plantation could move through the world as though it belonged to her. This was not a small thing to say in 1912, It was, in its way, as significant as anything else she had built. The factories, the agents, the distribution network, those were the infrastructure of an empire. But the photographs were the empire's declaration. They told black women across America that the world was larger than the circumstances it had assigned them, and that at least one of their own was out there moving through it, unhurried and unashamed, in clothes that cost more than a month's wages. She returned to the United States with expanded markets, new agents, and a reputation that had crossed oceanic borders. She was 44 years old. She was, by any reasonable measure, only getting started. By 1913, Madame Walker was earning what the great industrial families of America earned. The kind of money that, in that era, bought not just comfort, but consequence. Conservative estimates placed her annual income above $100,000. Some accounts put it closer to $200,000. The average American family was earning $800 a year. Walker was accumulating wealth at a rate that belonged by every social convention of the time, exclusively to white men. She responded the way dynasties always respond when the money reaches a certain altitude. She began to acquire. In Indianapolis, she expanded her real estate holdings beyond the factory. In New York, she purchased a townhouse in Harlem, 136 West 136th Street, in a neighborhood that was rapidly becoming the center of black cultural and intellectual life in America. The Harlem of 1913 was not yet the Harlem of legend, but the foundations were being poured. Walker could see what was coming. She wanted to be inside it when it arrived. But Harlem was a townhouse. What she was planning next was something else entirely. In 1913, she sailed to Europe. This was not a leisure trip, though it included the pleasures that European travel afforded the very wealthy in that era: Paris in the spring, Monte Carlo, the long light of the French Riviera. Walker moved through these places with the specific attention of someone taking notes. She visited the great houses. She studied the architecture of Italian villas, the proportion of their rooms, the way their terraces negotiated between interior grandeur and the landscape below. She met with art dealers in Paris and furniture makers whose work appeared in the finest estates on the continent. She was doing research. The great American fortunes of the Gilded Age had largely looked to Europe for instruction. The Vanderbilts had hired Richard Morris Hunt, who had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, to build Biltmore in the manner of a French Loire Valley chateau. Marjorie Merriweather Post would import 36,000 antique Spanish tiles for Mar-a-Lago. The language of serious American wealth in that period was always, at least partly, European. A borrowed grammar of marble and tapestry, and centuries-old craftsmanship that said, unmistakably, that its owner understood civilization and could afford to live inside it. Walker understood this language. She intended to speak it fluently. In 1914, she purchased land in Irvington-on-Hudson. The village sat 20 miles north of Manhattan, on the eastern bank of the river, in the corridor where wealthy white New York had been building country estates since before the Civil War. Washington Irving had lived there. John D. Rockefeller maintained Kykuit not far to the north. The families who kept homes along this stretch of the Hudson represented the oldest and most entrenched money in America, the kind that had stopped needing to be discussed because it had been present long enough to become simply the condition of the place. No black families lived in Irvington. Walker paid $27,000 for 4.5 acres overlooking the river and commissioned Vertner Tandy to design the house. Tandy was one of the first licensed black architects in New York State, a graduate of Tuskegee who had gone on to Cornell, who had designed churches and schools and private homes for black clients across the Northeast, with a precision and ambition that had never been given the commissions it deserved. For Walker, he would design something that had no real precedent: an Italian Renaissance villa on the Hudson River, owned by a black woman, built to rival anything her white neighbors had inherited or constructed. The plans called for 34 rooms across 3 floors, 20,000 square feet, cream-colored stucco walls, a red tile roof, carved stone balustrades, arched windows, ornamental ironwork, the whole vocabulary of the great Italian estates Walker had studied the previous year, translated to the banks of the Hudson and scaled to announce, without equivocation, that its owner had arrived and intended to remain. Construction began in 1916. Walker had budgeted $150,000. She would exceed that considerably. She supervised the project with the same attention she gave her factories. Walker traveled from Indianapolis to monitor progress, making decisions about materials and finishes with the specificity of someone who had spent years studying what distinguished the merely expensive from the genuinely fine. She was not decorating a house. She was building a statement, and she knew the difference between the two. When the pace slowed, material shortages, labor complications, and eventually the resource demands of a country at war, she used the delays to refine rather than simply wait. She corresponded with Tandy about modifications. She wanted a solarium to capture the river views. She requested additional bathrooms, more closets, the small adjustments that transform a plan into a life. The plans expanded. The budget followed. She also turned her attention to the grounds. Walker consulted horticulturists about which plants would survive and flourish in the Hudson Valley climate. She wanted gardens that moved through the seasons, blooming from spring through fall, designed to receive guests at any point in the year and offer something worth seeing. Terrace lawns would descend toward the river in formal geometric progression. Stone pathways would connect garden rooms planted with roses, peonies, hydrangeas. A reflecting pool would hold the sky. The greenhouse would sustain orchids and tropical specimens year-round. Fresh flowers would move through the house daily, arrangements changed by staff every morning. This was the logic of the great estates. Not just grandeur, but maintenance. The ongoing, expensive demonstration that the grandeur was intentional and permanent rather than borrowed and provisional. By 1918, the mansion was nearly complete, and Walker needed to name it. She consulted Enrico Caruso, the great Italian tenor, whose voice was then among the most celebrated in the world, and who was among the remarkable range of people Walker moved through at this point in her life. Caruso suggested a combination: her daughter Lelia's name, joined with the first letters of Walker and Robinson, Lelia's married surname, Villa Lewaro. Walker adopted it immediately. The name was European in its register, personal in its meaning, and entirely her own in its construction. It announced that this was not a house, but an estate, a property with its own identity, its own name, its own place in the order of things. The great Hudson Valley estates all had names: Kikuit, Lyndhurst, Sunnyside. Villa Lewaro would take its place among them. She was 50 years old. The finished house overwhelmed first-time visitors in the particular way that serious architecture is designed to do, not through a single dramatic gesture, but through accumulated precision, each room calibrated to reinforce the impression established by the one before. The entrance set the terms. Massive wooden doors imported from Italy opened into a two-story hall where black and white marble tiles covered the floor in a checkerboard pattern that seemed to extend indefinitely under 20-foot coffered ceilings decorated with gold leaf. A grand staircase of hand-carved mahogany curved upward to the second floor. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead. Natural light fell through tall windows onto surfaces that had been selected individually for exactly this effect. It was the grammar of power rendered in stone and light. The Vanderbilts knew this grammar. The Rockefellers knew it. Now Walker knew it too, and had built a room that made the same argument their entrance halls made: that the person who lived here had not stumbled into wealth, but had constructed a relationship with it, had thought carefully about what it meant and how it should be expressed. The music room occupied the entire east wing of the first floor, 40 feet by 30, with 18-foot ceilings. A pipe organ commissioned from the Este Organ Company of Vermont, $8,000, hand-carved wooden pipes, ivory keys, filled one wall. A Steinway grand piano stood nearby, Rows of chairs could accommodate 60 guests for performances and recitals. Walker intended to fill this room with music. She intended to fill it with the people making black culture in America and give them a stage worthy of what they were creating. The library held her growing collection: books on business, history, black culture, the African continent, arranged on floor-to-ceiling shelves accessible by a rolling ladder, leather chairs, reading lamps, the intimacy of a room designed for thinking. African art and artifacts filled the spaces between shelves, pieces Walker had acquired during her travels, the beginning of a collection that reflected both the European aesthetic she had studied and the African heritage she had no intention of setting aside. The formal dining room could seat 24 at the custom-made table. Chairs upholstered in silk damask, a 12-foot sideboard along one wall, crystal and china in built-in cabinets, silver serving pieces bearing Walker's monogram. The room opened onto a terrace above the river. Walker's private suite occupied much of the second floor. A four-poster bed with silk hangings, a sitting room for private meetings and correspondence, a marble bathroom with a separate shower and floor-to-ceiling mirrors, a dressing room for the dozens of gowns, day dresses, and coats that she maintained with the same care she applied to everything else bearing her name. 6 additional guest bedrooms, each with private baths, occupied the remainder of the floor. Rooms for the writers and leaders and activists and artists she intended to bring to this house and keep, for a few days at a time, away from the city and the scrutiny. The third floor held the staff quarters, 8 bedrooms for the live-in servants. The basement housed the mechanical systems: coal-fired boiler, commercial kitchen with industrial stoves capable of preparing meals for large gatherings, a dumbwaiter connecting kitchen to dining room, a wine cellar stocked with bottles from Europe and California. Walker drank little herself. She served wine because she understood that hospitality at this level was also a form of argument. The garage held 3 cars, including a custom electric vehicle from the Detroit Electric Car Company, mahogany interior trim, leather seats, silent enough to move through the neighborhood without announcing itself. 2 gasoline-powered cars handled longer distances. A chauffeur who doubled as a handyman maintained all 3 and drove Walker wherever she needed to go. Between 12 and 15 staff members kept the estate running, depending on the season. A head housekeeper, a cook, 2 maids, gardeners reporting to a head groundskeeper, a personal secretary managing correspondence and appointments. Walker paid all of them above standard rates. She had been on the other side of that transaction, had been the person whose labor was worth almost nothing to the people who required it, and she did not forget the arithmetic of that position. She furnished the rooms with pieces acquired during her European travels: French armchairs in silk brocade, Italian marble-top tables, English antique cabinets, Persian rugs across hardwood floors in every major room, oil paintings in gilded frames, European landscapes alongside African subjects, the 2 traditions coexisting on her walls as she had always coexisted between the 2 worlds they represented. And in the entrance hall, where no visitor could enter the house without encountering it, a portrait of Walker herself. Seated, an elegant gown, her expression the expression of a woman who has decided, once and for all, exactly who she is. She moved in during the summer of 1918. The final cost had exceeded $250,000, roughly $7 million in today's currency. It was the most expensive home ever purchased by a Black American. On the hillside above the Hudson, surrounded by the estates of families whose money was old enough to have forgotten where it came from, stood a house that a woman born on a Louisiana plantation had built from nothing in the span of a single lifetime through the force of an intelligence that the world had done everything in its considerable power to suppress. The Vanderbilts had Biltmore. The Rockefellers had Kikwit. The Astors had their river estates stretching north toward Rhinebeck. Madam C.J. Walker had Villa Lewaro. She had proven what she set out to prove. The question now was whether the world would acknowledge it. It would not. Not yet. Not in the ways she had hoped. But the house was there. The house was real. And stone, unlike social acceptance, does not require anyone's permission to stand. There is a particular illusion that great wealth tends to produce in the people who build it from nothing. The illusion is this, that money, accumulated in sufficient quantity, becomes a solvent, that it dissolves the barriers other people construct, that a woman who owns a house as fine as any house on the river cannot reasonably be told she does not belong on the river. Walker had built her life on the premise that excellence was an argument. She had proven it in business, in philanthropy, in the sheer accumulating force of what she had created from $1.50 a day. She arrived at Villa Lewaro believing, with the confidence of someone who had never yet been proven wrong, that the same logic applied here. She was about to learn that certain doors are not locked by logic. She applied to the Irvington Country Club shortly after moving in. The club sat near her estate. Its membership rolls included the old Hudson River families, names that had been on the county deed records for generations, people whose wealth was so established it had become simply the background condition of the place, unremarkable because it had never been otherwise. They gathered at the club the way such families gather, exclusive by habit rather than explicit policy, the exclusion so long practiced it no longer required discussion. Walker's application was rejected. No explanation was offered. None was needed. She understood the arithmetic immediately. She applied to the yacht club. Rejected. She attempted to join a women's charitable organization. Rejected again. The pattern was consistent and the message was singular. The credentials she had assembled over a lifetime, the empire, the mansion, the European furniture, the pipe organ, the Steinway, the portrait in the entrance hall, none of it constituted the credential that actually mattered in Irvington on Hudson in 1918. White neighbors began circulating petitions. The arguments they offered were the familiar ones: property values, neighborhood character, the preservation of traditions that the petitioners declined to examine too closely. Beneath the bureaucratic language of community standards ran a simpler, uglier current. If Walker was permitted to stay, others might follow. The exclusivity of the corridor depended on its impermeability. One breach was a precedent was a threat. Local newspapers weighed in with the particular condescension of publications that believed themselves to be fair-minded. Some described the mansion in admiring detail while managing to suggest that such luxury was, in a woman of Walker's background, somehow presumptuous. Others acknowledged her business success in the same breath they used to question its legitimacy. The Irvington paper ran an editorial about neighborhood character and shared traditions, written in the careful language of people who understand that what they mean and what they can print are different things. Walker read all of it. She understood all of it. And she made a decision that was, given her history, entirely predictable. She stayed. She would not sell. She would not reduce her presence to the dimensions that made her neighbors comfortable. She had purchased this land legally, built this house with her own capital, and she would live in it with the full dignity of someone who had earned every room. What she did instead was transform the rejection into architecture of a different kind. If Irvington's clubs would not have her, Villa Lewaro would become something no club on the Hudson River had ever been. She opened the doors to W.E.B. Du Bois, who came to dinner and stayed to talk. James Weldon Johnson attended gatherings, the poet and civil rights strategist who understood, as Walker did, that culture and politics were not separate endeavors, but the same endeavor pursued through different rooms. Mary McLeod Bethune came, the educator who had built a college from almost nothing, and understood what Walker's house represented to the women who would hear about it. These were not social calls. The conversations that happened at Villa Lewaro in those years were operational. The Great Migration was moving hundreds of thousands of Black Americans from the rural South to the urban North, reshaping the demographic and political geography of the country. Racial violence was intensifying in response. The NAACP was building the legal architecture of a challenge to segregation that would take decades to complete. The people sitting in Walker's dining room, eating from gold-rimmed china, drinking from crystal that caught the light off the river. They were planning. Walker funded much of what they planned. She donated to the NAACP, to the National Association of Colored Women, to black colleges, orphanages, homes for the elderly, the institutions that constituted the infrastructure of a community that the larger society had decided to leave to its own resources. Villa Lewaro gave her philanthropy a stage and a center of gravity. The house was where the work gathered. She also threw parties, elaborate ones, musicians in the music room, dancers in the entrance hall, guests in the finest clothes black society could produce, eating and drinking in a setting that made the point simply by existing. The Harlem Renaissance was finding its voice in those years, and Walker positioned Villa Lewaro as part of the conversation. She commissioned musicians. She purchased work from black artists and hung it on the walls of a house that white Irvington refused to acknowledge as legitimate. She was building a counterculture, not in opposition to American elegance, but within it, insisting that black Americans could create spaces of refinement equal to anything the old families of the Hudson Valley had assembled over their generations of accumulated comfort. An invitation to Villa Lewaro became, in black society, a currency of its own. To have attended meant something. It meant you were part of what was being built. The argument, the movement, the ongoing demonstration that black excellence was not an exception to be studied, but a condition to be expected. Some white progressives sought invitations and occasionally received them. Walker was selective in her welcome. She had no interest in performing achievement for audiences whose curiosity was essentially anthropological. No appetite for being observed as a phenomenon rather than engaged as a peer. But she cultivated the white allies who came in good faith, understanding that political change, in that era, as in any era, required coalitions. Some of those relationships proved useful when she needed influence in rooms she could not enter directly. Lelia moved through the house differently than her mother did. Where Walker used Villa Lewaro as a platform, for strategy, for activism, for the deliberate construction of black cultural institutions, Lelia used it as a stage. The jazz parties she hosted ran until the river turned grey with dawn. The guest lists pushed further into the bohemian edges of Harlem society. The line between celebration and politics blurred, and Lelia was not particularly concerned with drawing it clearly. She was not wrong to celebrate. The house was worth celebrating. What was being built in Black America in those years was worth celebrating. But the approaches of mother and daughter revealed something about what Villa Lewaro meant, and to whom, whether it was primarily an instrument or primarily a symbol, whether its purpose was to change the world outside its walls, or to create within them a world worth inhabiting. Perhaps it was always both. What did not change through any of it was Irvington's position. The clubs remained closed. Neighbors who passed Walker on the street looked elsewhere. When she moved through town in her electric car, quiet, mahogany-trimmed, the most technologically sophisticated vehicle in the neighborhood, white residents turned their faces away. Children were instructed not to interact with any black children who might be visiting the estate. The local churches did not extend a welcome. Walker traveled to Harlem or Manhattan to worship, returning to a house that the surrounding community continued, with remarkable consistency, to pretend was not there. She had believed, going into this, that wealth was the universal argument, that the finest house, the finest clothes, the finest manners, that all of it, assembled with sufficient care and expense, would eventually compel acknowledgement. She had built her entire life on the principle that excellence could not be permanently denied. In business, that had been true. Here, it was not. Skin color, it turned out, operated outside the market. It did not respond to capital. It did not yield to demonstration. The families of the Hudson River corridor had decided, long before Walker arrived, what the neighborhood was and who it was for, and no amount of Italian Renaissance architecture or Steinway grand pianos or gold-rimmed china was going to revise that decision. This was the hidden price of the house. Not the $250,000. Not the staff, the upkeep, the landscaping, the maintenance of a standard that had to be flawless because anything less would be used against her. The price was the discovery, late in a life that had survived everything, that some things cannot be bought, and that you build anyway. The body keeps its own accounting. For years, Walker had been spending from reserves she could not replenish. 16-hour days, punishing travel schedules, the constant metabolic cost of building and defending an empire while simultaneously fighting a society that resented its existence. Doctors had been warning her since at least 1917. Her blood pressure was dangerously elevated. She needed to reduce her hours, her stress, the relentless forward pressure that had been the condition of her life since she was old enough to work a cotton field. She had ignored them with the particular confidence of someone who had never yet been stopped by anything. By 1919, the body presented the bill. The kidneys were failing. The hypertension had damaged them in ways that could not be reversed. Not in 1919, not with the medicine available, not with anything. When the doctors delivered this assessment in April of that year, Walker was 51 years old. She had too much unfinished work to be seriously ill. She received the diagnosis and returned to Villa Lewaro, where she proceeded to manage her empire from her bedroom. She dictated letters to her secretary. She received advisors and executives who made the trip up from the city. She planned product launches from her bed. She tracked competitors who were copying her formulas and undercutting her prices, and she strategized responses to them with the same focused attention she had given to business problems when she could still walk the factory floor in Indianapolis. The work was not stubbornness exactly, it was identity. Walker had never fully separated herself from what she had built. The company was not something she ran, it was something she was. And the idea of setting it down was not restfulness, but erasure. Beyond that, she was genuinely afraid of what would happen to the thousands of women whose livelihoods depended on the Walker Company continuing to function, to innovate, to hold its market position against the competitors gathering at its edges. She had trained managers. She had promoted executives and given them authority. But she knew, with the unsentimental clarity of someone who had built everything herself, that vision is not transferable through org charts. You can teach the system. You cannot teach the person. Through the summer of 1919, the symptoms accumulated. Severe headaches, vision that blurred and sharpened unpredictably, difficulty breathing. The doctors prescribed complete bed rest and offered nothing else because there was nothing else to offer. Kidney failure in 1919 was a sentence, not a diagnosis. Medicine could name what was happening. It could not stop it. The final months at Villa Lewaro had a particular quality. The house doing, at last, what houses of that kind are ultimately built to do. Not to impress. Not to make arguments to neighbors who would not receive them. But to hold the people you love in rooms large enough for all of it. The grief, the business, the unfinished plans, the goodbyes that no one quite names as goodbyes while they are happening. Lelia stayed at the mansion to care for her mother. Walker's granddaughter May was there. Friends came from New York, from Indianapolis, from the network of relationships Walker had built across decades. They found her weakened but entirely present, the mind still sharp, still organized around the problems that had organized it for 30 years. She worked with her lawyers to clarify the final provisions. 2/3 of the company's future profits would go to charitable institutions, the NAACP, the Tuskegee Institute, black orphanages, homes for the elderly. The specific institutions were named. The amounts were specified. Walker had never done anything imprecisely, and she did not begin now. Lelia would inherit Villa Lewaro and a substantial trust. May would receive her portion. The business would be managed by the executives Walker had prepared for exactly this moment, and would continue, she specified this, she required this, serving the agents whose lives it had changed. She had spent her entire adult life building something that was larger than herself. She intended it to remain larger than herself after she was gone. On May 25, 1920, Madam C.J. Walker, died at Villa Lewaro. She was 52 years old. The funeral was held 3 days later in the music room where she had hosted the finest performers Black America had produced, where the pipe organ she had commissioned for $8,000 had filled the house with sound on evenings that became legendary. Now the organ played hymns. The casket rested at the center of the room, surrounded by flowers on every surface. She was dressed as she had always dressed, with the full, unapologetic elegance of a woman who understood that appearance was never merely vanity, but always, also, a position. The estate could not hold the mourners. They lined the driveway. They filled the grounds that descended toward the river. They had come from distant cities, from across the network of relationships and obligations and transformations that Walker had set in motion over 3 decades. The Walker agents arrived in their finest clothes, the women whose lives she had reorganized around the radical premise that their labor was worth something, that they were worth something, and who had come to say so in the only language adequate to the occasion. Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr. of the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem delivered the eulogy. He spoke about what Walker had proven, not simply that a Black woman could build wealth, but that the capacity for genius and vision and relentless, disciplined ambition existed in Black women as fully as it existed in anyone, and that the only thing that had ever prevented its expression was a society organized to suppress it. Walker had declined to be suppressed. That was the whole of the story, and it was enough. The service lasted 3 hours. Afterward, the casket was transported to Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, where Walker was buried in a plot she had purchased herself. Among industrialists and politicians and cultural figures whose names were carved into the permanent record of American life. Her headstone was plain, her name, her dates, no monument beyond that. She had never required the attention of people who were not paying it freely. The white newspapers ran brief obituaries. The New York Times acknowledged her fortune and mentioned Villa Lewaro, noted the hair care empire, described her as remarkable. The prose was correct and bloodless. The obituary of someone the paper recognized as unusual, without quite grasping why the unusual mattered, or to whom, or what it cost to become it. The Black press understood. The Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Baltimore Afro-American. Front pages, multi-day tributes, testimonials from the leaders and activists, and ordinary women whose lives had been altered by the existence of this one woman's ambition. They called her the greatest businesswoman the race had produced. They described what she had done in the language of people who knew what it meant to do it, who understood the specific weight of the obstacles, the specific dimensions of the achievement, the specific grief of losing someone who had proven in her own body and her own lifetime that it was possible. She had lived 52 years, born in the immediate aftermath of slavery on a plantation in Louisiana, to parents who had spent their entire lives as property, orphaned before 7, widowed at 20 under circumstances she never spoke of publicly, a washerwoman, a woman whose hair fell out from the accumulated stress of surviving, a woman who dreamed a formula and built it into an empire that stretched from Harlem to Havana. She had constructed a mansion that rivaled the great estates of the Hudson Valley and filled it with the finest things the world would sell her, and then filled it with the finest people Black America was producing, and turned it into something no amount of old money on the river had ever managed to create. A genuine center of culture, activism, and possibility. And she had never been accepted, not by the country club, not by the yacht club, not by the neighbors who turned their faces when her car moved through the street. The white world she had tried to enter on its own terms had looked at everything she built and decided that the one thing she could not change was the only thing that mattered. She knew this. She had known it for years. She built anyway. She stayed anyway. She kept the doors of Villa Lewaro open to everyone the world outside had closed its doors against. And she died in the house she had built on a hillside above a river that did not belong to anyone. And the house remained standing after she was gone. It is still standing. That was always the point. The great estates of American history tend to follow the same arc. A founder builds, an heir inherits. And somewhere in the passage between those two facts, in the gap between the person who understood what the thing cost and the person who simply received it, something shifts. The discipline that created the wealth does not always travel with the wealth itself. What transfers is the lifestyle. What stays behind is the hunger that produced it. Lelia Walker Robinson was 34 years old when she inherited Villa Lewaro. She had grown up inside her mother's empire, had worked in the business since childhood, had watched Walker build something from nothing with a focus and relentlessness that left little room for anything else. Lelia had absorbed the aesthetic of what her mother created without fully inheriting the appetite that drove the creation. She loved the house. She loved what it represented. She had different ideas about what it was for. Where Walker had used Villa Lewaro as a platform for strategy, for activism, for the deliberate construction of black political and cultural institutions, Lelia used it as a stage. The distinction matters. Through the 1920s, the music room filled with jazz bands rather than civil rights strategists. The entrance hall, where Walker's portrait still watched from above the marble floor, hosted dancing that ran past midnight and well into the Hudson River dawn. Langston Hughes became a regular. County Cullen came. Zora Neale Hurston moved through the rooms that had once held W.E.B. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson, and the conversation shifted register, from the operational language of movement building to the looser, more intoxicating language of art and personality and the particular electricity of Harlem in its flowering decade. Alcohol flowed through Prohibition without apparent concern. Carl Van Vechten, the white writer and photographer who had made himself a kind of cultural ambassador between white patronage and black artistry, became one of Lelia's closest companions and a fixture at the estate. The parties became legendary. An invitation to Villa Lewaro in the 1920s was a credential in black society, a confirmation that you had arrived at the center of the most vital cultural conversation in America. Some looked at what Lelia was doing and saw squandering. Others saw a different but legitimate form of the same argument her mother had been making, that black Americans could create spaces of beauty and freedom and genuine celebration, that joy was also a form of resistance, that the Harlem Renaissance deserved a room worthy of it. Both readings were probably correct. They were also, financially, beside the point. Maintaining a 34-room Italian Renaissance villa on the Hudson River required money in quantities that did not diminish because the owner was having a good time. Staff salaries, property taxes, heating costs for a house built to impress on a scale that made every utility bill an event. The grounds alone, the formal gardens, the greenhouse, the terraces descending to the river, demanded continuous, expensive attention to remain what they had been designed to be. Walker had covered these costs from the operating income of an empire she ran with fierce personal attention. Lelia covered them from inheritance and declining company dividends, which is a fundamentally different and less sustainable arrangement. When the Depression arrived in 1929, the arithmetic collapsed entirely. The Walker Company's customer base, working-class black women across the country, was among the first and hardest hit by the economic catastrophe. When families cannot afford food, they do not purchase hair care products. Sales fell sharply. Dividends shrank. The income Lelia had been spending against disappeared, but the costs of Villa Lewaro did not. She began dismantling the estate in the incremental, painful way that people dismantle things they cannot bring themselves to abandon outright. The third-floor staff quarters were converted into rental apartments. The greenhouse was leased. Outbuildings followed. Eventually, rooms on the second floor, the guest bedrooms Walker had filled with the leaders of Black America, went to long-term boarders. The mansion that had been built as a monument became, piece by piece, a rooming house. By the early 1930s, Lelia was spending most of her time at her Harlem townhouse, the estate she visited on weekends. The staff had been reduced to the minimum required to keep the building from falling into immediate disrepair. The formal gardens went unattended. Weeds moved through the geometric beds that Walker's horticulturists had designed to bloom from spring through fall. The reflecting pool that had once mirrored the Hudson River sky filled with debris and cracked along its edges. The room stood empty. On August 9, 1931, Lelia Walker Robinson suffered a cerebral hemorrhage at a friend's birthday party in Long Branch, New Jersey. She was 46 years old. Langston Hughes, who had danced in her entrance hall and drunk her wine through her legendary parties, wrote a poem for her. Thousands came to the funeral at the Abyssinian Baptist Church. The procession stretched for blocks through Harlem. She left behind debts exceeding $100,000 and a mansion her daughter May had neither the interest nor the resources to maintain. Villa Lewaro went into foreclosure in 1932. The house that had cost Madam Walker more than $250,000 to build, that had been constructed, room by room, as an argument about what black wealth could look like in America, sold at auction for $47,000. It is difficult to read that number without feeling the full weight of what it represents. Not just the financial loss, which was total, but the symbolic collapse. The speed with which something built to last, built to matter, built to stand on a hillside above the Hudson and say something permanent about black possibility, could be reduced to a creditor's transaction and a gavel falling in an empty room. The Irvington Convalescent Home purchased the property. The music room, where Walker had installed an $8,000 pipe organ and seated 60 guests for performances, became a common area. The dining room that had accommodated 24 at a single table now served institutional meals. Bedrooms were subdivided. The pipe organ was removed and sold. The furniture Walker had selected during her European travels, the French armchairs, the Italian marble top tables, the Persian rugs, was auctioned off in lots. Most of the original furnishings vanished into private hands and were never recovered. The patients who lived there had no idea whose house they occupied. For decades, that was the condition of Villa Lewaro, a nursing home, slowly deteriorating, deferred maintenance compounding across years into serious structural damage, the roof leaking, windows cracking and going unreplaced, plaster separating from ceilings in rooms that had once been decorated with gold leaf. The terrace gardens that Walker had planned with horticulturists disappeared entirely under scrub growth. Historical significance, it turns out, does not insulate a building from neglect. It does not pay for a new roof. The nursing home closed in 1973. The property sat vacant. Vandals broke the remaining windows. Water moved through the interior unchecked. The mansion appeared to be approaching, slowly and without drama, the same end that meets most forgotten buildings: demolition. In 1976, a black investment banker from New Orleans named Harold Doley purchased it for $60,000. He repaired the roof, he stabilized the structure, he researched the original design, and began the painstaking work of tracing what had been lost, tracking down furnishings that had been sold at auction 50 years earlier, commissioning restoration of the entrance hall's marble floors, gradually returning the house to something resembling itself. The work exceeded his resources before it could be completed. In 1981, the federal government designated Villa Lewaro a National Historic Landmark. The designation was acknowledgement without investment, a recognition that the house mattered to American history, unaccompanied by any meaningful commitment to preserving it. The mansion remained privately owned, inaccessible to the public, and still in need of the full restoration that the landmark status implied, but did not fund. The rediscovery came slowly, then with gathering momentum. Arlelia Bundles, Walker's great-great-granddaughter, a journalist who had spent decades researching her ancestor's life, published books, delivered lectures, and advocated publicly for the preservation of Villa Lewaro, with the persistence of someone who understood that the house was not simply a building, but the physical record of an argument that America had not yet finished making. In 2014, the National Trust for Historic Preservation listed Villa Lewaro among the 11 most endangered historic places in the country. The designation brought attention, and attention brought resources, and in 2018, new owners purchased the property and committed to a full restoration. Architects returned to Vertner Tandy's original plans. Historians worked from photographs and documents to reconstruct what each room had looked like in 1918, in the year Walker moved in, and the house was new, and everything it was built to say was still being said. Craftsmen began the slow, exacting work of repair, the entrance hall returning to its original grandeur, the grounds being replanted according to the original landscape designs, the rooms being prepared to receive visitors who will walk through them and learn what happened here. What was built here, and by whom, and at what cost. And what it means that it nearly disappeared, that the house which White Irvington refused to accept was very nearly lost not to hostility, but to time and debt, and the ordinary entropy that swallows great things when no one is paying sufficient attention. It did not disappear. The house held, as Walker always intended it to. What Walker built was larger than any single building could contain. At the peak of her company's operations, somewhere between 20 and 40,000 women worked as Walker agents across the United States, the Caribbean, and Central America. They moved through black neighborhoods with cases of product and a pitch that was, underneath its commercial surface, a proposition about identity. You are worth caring for. Your appearance is not vanity, it is self-presentation. And self-presentation is power, and power is something you can learn to exercise. Walker trained them herself, at first, and then through the college she had established in Pittsburgh. The curriculum went well beyond product demonstration. How to approach a stranger's door without apology, how to speak about money without embarrassment, how to handle an objection, close a sale, manage inventory, track income, build a customer base that returned because the relationship was genuine. These were skills that the domestic economy, the world of laundering and cooking and child-rearing in other people's houses that consumed most of the labor available to black women in that era, had never offered and had no interest in offering. Walker was building, through 40,000 individual women, an alternative economy. One that operated on the radical premise that black women's work was worth paying for properly, and that the women doing it were entitled to the dignity and the income that followed. The agents understood what they had been given. They said so, repeatedly, in letters and testimonials and the public declarations they made at the annual Walker conventions, gatherings that were part sales conference, part revival, part political organizing session, where top performers received awards and prominent speakers addressed the crowd, and Walker herself moved through the room as both founder and proof of concept. She had done this. They were doing this. The next generation would do more. Some of them became genuinely wealthy by the standards of their communities. Top agents cleared thousands of dollars annually. They bought homes. They sent children to college. They invested in property and started other businesses, carrying the Walker model, the idea that you could build something that belonged to you, into enterprises Walker had never imagined. She encouraged it. She wanted the agents to think beyond her products, to understand that what she had given them was not a job but a template. The conventions also served purposes that never appeared on the official agenda. Walker used them to push civil rights causes. The NAACP, voter registration, the legal challenges to segregation that were slowly assembling the architecture of a future the participants could not yet fully see. She framed economic success and political organizing not as competing priorities, but as the same project pursued through different means. Build wealth, she argued, and you build leverage. Build leverage, and you change what the law will tolerate. This position put her in productive tension with the major intellectual currents of the era. W.E.B. Du Bois admired her achievements and worried that the focus on commerce distracted from more fundamental demands for political equality. Booker T. Washington, who died in 1915, had championed precisely the kind of economic self-reliance Walker embodied. Walker, characteristically, refused to choose between them. She funded the NAACP and built factories. She donated to anti-lynching campaigns and expanded into the Caribbean. She held both things simultaneously, with the pragmatic confidence of someone who had learned that the world does not wait for its contradictions to be resolved before requiring you to act. In July of 1917, 10,000 Black Americans marched silently down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. No chants, no music, just the deliberate, sustained presence of people who had decided that silence could be louder than noise. They carried signs protesting racial violence and the epidemic of lynching consuming the South. Walker had helped fund the transportation that made the march possible. She understood that money, directed with precision, could put bodies in the streets of the most powerful city in America and make a point that legislation had not yet been able to make. That was philanthropy as strategy. It was also simply what she believed was owed. Her advertising broke ground that the industry would take decades to fully map. She was among the first American entrepreneurs to use before and after photography in commercial advertising, images that showed, with the blunt visual logic of results, what the Walker system could do for damaged hair and struggling scalps. She deployed customer testimonials in Black newspapers across the country, letters from real women describing real outcomes, building the kind of credibility that claims alone cannot produce. And at the center of every advertisement, her own face. Her photograph appeared on every product. Her biography, the rise from a Louisiana plantation, the years as a washerwoman, the formula, the empire, was the central narrative of her marketing. She understood, decades before the concept had a name, that she was not selling hair care. She was selling the story of what was possible. She was telling every Black woman who saw the advertisement that the distance between where they were and where Walker had arrived was not fixed. It was traversable. Someone who looked like them had traversed it. This was not sentiment. It was the most sophisticated marketing strategy in her industry, and it worked with a consistency that her competitors, who had largely decided Black women were not worth addressing as customers at all, could not match or explain. The debate about hair straightening shadowed all of it. Marcus Garvey argued that the Walker system represented accommodation to white standards, that Black women who altered the texture of their hair were participating in their own diminishment. Walker's position was direct. Her products treated scalp disease and gave women control over their own appearance in a society that was constantly attempting to control it for them. The choice of what to do with one's hair belonged to the woman whose hair it was. That was not assimilation, that was autonomy. The argument has not ended. It surfaces in different language in every generation. The underlying questions about identity and presentation and the politics of appearance remaining as live and unresolved as they were when Walker first had to answer them publicly. What Walker left behind was not a resolution but a precedent. The insistence that Black women were entitled to make their own decisions, and that a business built on that insistence was not only legitimate, but necessary. She was also navigating, throughout all of this, the specific social geography of a Black woman who had become wealthy enough to be noticed by people who would have preferred not to notice her. Some white responses to her success were openly hostile. The country club rejections, the neighborhood petitions, the editorial language about community character. Others were something more insidious, the patronizing acknowledgement of an exceptional case. The white journalists who described Walker as remarkable were simultaneously implying that her remarkableness was an anomaly, that she was an outlier whose success said nothing about the capacity of Black women generally. They praised her in a register that preserved the prejudice. She recognized this, used the coverage anyway, and did not confuse being written about with being understood. Within black communities, she navigated a different set of pressures. Certain segments of the black professional class, lighter skinned, credentialed, careful about the associations they cultivated, kept a strategic distance from an entrepreneur whose business was so explicitly tied to working-class black women's domestic lives. Walker responded by doubling down on exactly that association. She was proud of her dark skin. She was proud of where she had come from. She refused to perform the kind of respectability that required pretending her origins were other than they were, and this refusal earned her something more durable than the acceptance of any particular social class: the genuine loyalty of the ordinary women her company served. The company survived her by 65 years. Through the 1920s, it remained profitable, operating on the infrastructure Walker had built and the brand loyalty she had earned. The Depression damaged it as it damaged everything, but the Walker name held. By the 1950s and 1960s, however, the competitive landscape had shifted fundamentally. Major corporations had finally noticed the black consumer market that Walker had identified and served for decades, and they brought resources to it that a family-controlled legacy company could not match. The Walker system was no longer distinctive in a marketplace that now offered dozens of alternatives. In 1985, the manufacturing operation ceased. The brand was sold. A limited product line continued under the Walker name, largely disconnected from anything Walker herself would have recognized as her business. What remained were the buildings. The factory in Indianapolis was preserved and converted into the Madam Walker Legacy Center, a theater, community spaces, exhibits. Her Indianapolis home became a museum. These sites hold the operational story, the business history, the record of the empire she built and managed from the center of the country. But Villa Lewaro is the crown. Villa Lewaro is where the personal and the political and the architectural converge into something that resists ordinary categorization. It is a house, and it is an argument, and it is a monument, and it is a wound that is slowly, carefully being healed by people who understand that some things are worth the effort of preservation even when, especially when, they nearly didn't survive. Alelia Bundles, Walker's great-great-granddaughter, has spent decades ensuring that the story reaches people who would not otherwise find it. She has written the books, given the lectures, appeared in the documentaries, advocated for the preservation funding, done the unglamorous archival work of keeping a legacy alive when institutions are not yet interested in sustaining it. She has understood what her ancestor understood, that the work is never finished, that the argument must be made continuously, that the moment you stop making it is the moment the world reverts to its defaults. When Villa Lewaro opens fully to the public, when the restoration is complete and the rooms are returned to what they were in 1918, when the entrance hall is showing its marble and the grounds are blooming as Walker's horticulturists designed them to bloom, visitors will walk through a house that contains, in its walls and its history and its improbable survival, the full complexity of what America has always been and what it has always refused to become. They will see where the Harlem Renaissance gathered and drank and argued and made art. They will see where civil rights strategy was planned in rooms that Irvington, 100 yards away, pretended did not exist. They will see the portrait in the entrance hall, the woman in the elegant gown, expression settled and undefeated. And they will understand that it was placed there deliberately, at eye level, where every visitor would have to meet her gaze. The house was always making an argument. It is still making it. The great dynastic estates of American history, Biltmore, Kikuit, Mar-a-Lago, the Newport cottages, the Hudson River properties of families whose names became synonymous with wealth itself, were built by people who believed they were building permanence. Most of them were right about the buildings and wrong about the dynasties. The families thinned and scattered and disappointed. The money moved. The houses outlasted the intentions of the people who commissioned them. Villa Lewaro is different in one essential way. It was not built to express a dynasty that already existed. It was built to announce the possibility of one. It was built by a woman who had no precedent, no inherited position, no family name that opened rooms, who built the name herself, from nothing, through the force of an intelligence and a will that the world had organized itself to suppress. And it nearly worked. The dynasty Walker envisioned did not hold. The money did not transfer cleanly. The house fell into other hands and other purposes, and very nearly into rubble. But the house itself held. On the hillside above the Hudson River, visible from the water to anyone who knows to look, the cream stucco walls and red tile roof of Villa Lewaro remain. Boaters moving up the river pass it without always knowing what they are passing. Some now know. More are learning as the restoration brings the story back into circulation, and the country slowly reckons with the full range of what it has produced, and what it has suppressed, and what it still owes to the people it has spent centuries attempting to make invisible. Sarah Breedlove was born with nothing, less than nothing, into the immediate aftermath of slavery, in a one-room cabin on a Louisiana plantation, on a dirt floor. She died as Madame C.J. Walker, in a 34-room Italian Renaissance villa that she had designed and commissioned and paid for, and filled with the finest things the world would sell her, and the finest people Black America was producing. The white society she had tried to enter on its own terms never accepted her. She built something better instead. And it is still standing. That was always, in the end, the only answer that mattered. Not the acceptance of people who had decided in advance what she was worth, but the stone and marble and mahogany fact of the house itself, visible from the river, refusing to disappear, outlasting every person who ever believed it had no right to be there. The mansion was never for her alone. It was for every woman who came after, and found in its existence the evidence that what seemed impossible had in fact already been done. Already.